I'm talking with our guest, Barbara Stripling of the University of Syracuse, where she is Senior Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Practice at the School of Information Studies. One of the things that she has done there is to create a new course on advocacy. You can read about Barbara's distinguished background in greater detail on the course site, but I'd just like to mention here that she is immediate past president of the American Library Association and a former president of the American Association of School Librarians. Welcome, Barbara, to the MOOC.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about libraries, community priorities, and advocacy, and how these are related. Of course, sometimes in library land, we can make assumptions about the priorities of our communities that we haven't really verified. It's easy to be mistaken in these assumptions that we make, especially if our libraries are still very busy, and especially if some of our more frequent users make us just feel so good. They're so happy, they're so satisfied. So how should librarians identify actual community priorities and truly connect their libraries with these priorities?
I've been thinking a lot about that, especially since I'm teaching a course on advocacy. And I've actually thought through several steps that I think we can take to connect with the priorities of our community. The first thing, which was maybe the hardest thing for me to think about, is that we have to get over ourselves. We tend to be very convinced that we are sure that we know exactly what the community needs, and it's usually based on what we do well. So if we have a program in our library that is working well and we're very happy with it, and the few people who use it are happy with it, we think, well, then it's perfect and I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to change it. But that's not really how we need to target our services. It's not based on what we want. It actually is a process of turning outward and figuring out what our community wants. I could give you a personal example. I am personally passionate about inquiry and independent learning. So I've thought about, what if I am working in a library, let's say a public library, and it's during the recession. Everyone who's coming into the library is coming in to find a job. They don't have time for inquiry and independent discovery. They need to find a job. So I need to get over my passion for inquiry and figure out how to blend that in later after I really feel the aspirations of my community members who come in. So that's the first thing, get over ourselves. The second thing, and this is tricky, is that I think we need to figure out who in our community we need to talk to. It's very easy to talk to the people who come into the library, but we'll probably get the same stories. We know what they like, that's why they come into the library. What we have to do then is figure out what are the circles of influence in our community, what groups and what individuals actually have influence with others in the community. And it's not necessarily in a governing role. People have influence in all different ways. And so there may be a retired community. There may be a group of university students. You may have a community where churches are extremely important. And so it's important to be able to sit down and figure out what are all of those circles of influence, and then to figure out how are they connected to each other. Now, I did a map of a community, Fayetteville, Arkansas, when I lived there. And it was interesting because that community had a very large retired community. It had a very large church community, and it had a very large university student community. But what I figured out when I actually mapped it, and I created a map, a visual map based on the size of the different communities, and I drew lines to connect who talked to whom. What I figured out is that university students didn't talk to anybody in the community. They didn't talk to the retired people. They didn't talk to the business people. They didn't talk to the church people. So they were a very separate piece of the community, and yet they lived in that community for 9 months of the year. I also figured out that the retired people in the community weren't connected to the decision makers. And so I would hear complaints about what was offered in the community and the services, but it was because there were no lines of connection. Once we do that map, and that's really the second phase, is figuring out who all we need to talk to, then we can actually embark on the process of talking to them. One other point I wanted to bring up, though, about the communities is that you have to reach beyond the normal. And so you have to reach out to communities that you don't have a lot of contact with. Non-users, non-library users. There's a reason they're not using the library, maybe a very good reason. They may have all the resources they need in their homes, or they may just not understand what is available to them at the library. We also have to reach out to multiple perspectives. In every community, there are people who believe different things. It is important for us to pull in those different perspectives. So you may have retired people who really want a library. Their dream is to have a quiet, reflective place. And yet, parents in the community who want a vibrant young child programming space. Well, that's important to know because those may be conflicting perspectives, and yet there's a way that we can pull them together. And certainly on social issues, on things that happen in the community that are socially important concerns of the community, there are going to be multiple perspectives, and it's important to understand what those perspectives are. The third thing that I would say that we do then, after you've identified who you need to talk to, is to have both a formal and an informal way of information gathering. Now, informal we do all the time, but we need to do a little bit of a special effort. We need to be sure that when we have conversations in the library, that we can introduce the idea of what are your priorities? What would you really like to accomplish? And how do you think we might help you accomplish that? It's beyond the, did you find the books you need conversation, but it happens in an informal way, in a conversation way. Informal conversations can also happen outside in the community, and I think not only do we need to get over ourselves, but we need to get out of the library. Librarians are members of the community. We're all members of different groups in the community, and that's a source of strength for us. So we need to go to those groups that we're a part of and go to groups that we're not a part of and ask these questions in an informal way, in a conversational way. There's also a formal way of gathering information about community priorities and aspirations. And I would recommend one of two techniques that I think might work. One is you can have a community forum of maybe 5 to 10 people hoping for a balance of perspectives and different points of view. And then ask them specific questions, record the answers, and then you do an analysis of the conversation. Another way is to have a series of individual interviews. And I found with my class that most of them are opting for the individual interviews. They're easier to set up. Timing is definitely easier. And it's the same kind of process because you reach out to a diverse group of people, but they're not so influenced by what others say. There's a certain amount of trust building that you need to do when you have a community forum. And so if you haven't built that trust, then probably individual interviews will be better. I would suggest starting with simple questions. And I've adapted these from Harwood Institute, which ALA is aligning with. What kind of community do you want, and why is that important? Given what you've just said, what are the 2 to 3 most important issues or concerns that you feel that your community must confront? And then what do you think is keeping us from making progress in addressing those issues or concerns? And what are the kinds of things that we could do that would make a difference in reaching our priorities? So I've asked my class to ask those questions of community members and then to turn around and ask the librarian in the library they're working with, or in a couple of cases, they are the librarian, so ask them to reflect themselves, to really dig deep and reflect on what impacts do you want your library to have on the community. Now notice we're not asking what do you like best to offer in the library. What you're asking is what impacts do you want to have on your community? And what are the 2 to 3 most important issues that you see the community facing? What challenges are keeping your library from making the progress in helping people meet those issues or challenges? And then what kinds of things could be done to help your community reach its aspirations? After you have done those interviews with the librarian and with community members, then the last step is really an analysis and a synthesis of what you heard. Hopefully, and I don't know, my class hasn't gone through it yet, but I think that what we're going to be able to see, because the questions are similar enough, asking the librarian and asking the community, that I think we're going to be able to see where the congruence lies, where there are pieces of agreement, where the aspirations of the librarian and of the community members are the same, where they're pulling in the same direction. They see the same issues and the barriers, and perhaps even have thought of the same actions that will help you address those barriers. So that's the last step really in making sure that you are connected to the community, is pulling all this together, doing a very thoughtful analysis and synthesis, knowing that you're not going to be able to address every concern that was ever brought up. So you're going to have to prioritize based on what you hear. It's a lot of thinking at this point, but then being transparent back to the community members. This is what I heard. This is how it fit together with library, and this is how we're going to proceed based on what you told me. I think this is the step also where you can bring your passions back in. I'm not asking you to forget your passions, because that's what's going to make advocacy work, but you can figure out how to use your passions to help the community reach its aspirations and overcome any issues or concerns. So that's absolutely the most joyous piece of all of this, perhaps, is pulling it all together in a very positive way so that you can build an advocacy plan that truly addresses what the community dreams of achieving and overcome some of their issues and concerns.
Thank you. That certainly outlines a comprehensive, responsive, outward-looking methodology for exploring community aspirations. And that strikes me as a way to approach the community in a positive vein.
Yeah.
That is, in contrast to these approaches that say, what's wrong here? Where are the gaps? So you mentioned advocacy a couple of times. Do you have any more comments, Barbara, about how that methodology, how that outward-looking focus, how that conversation can actually strengthen the case that a library can make for support from its community?
Yeah, there are a number of ways, actually, that I think this approach strengthens your advocacy. I think, first of all, we have to remember that advocacy is not a one-time message. It's not a public awareness. It's not telling people, this is what we do and you better appreciate it. Advocacy is really helping a community change and reach its priorities. And that depends on sustained relationships. It depends on being aspirational, on having a solid plan that is flexible enough to change when you need to. So there are several things about this approach that feed right into a very solid advocacy plan. And the first thing is that it's built on consensus. So if you build it right and if you reflect back to the community, you're already going to have buy-in because people are going to recognize themselves in your advocacy plan and they're going to say, yes, that's my dream. Yes, the library is going to help me achieve my dream. So you'll have the buy-in right there. And it's not go support your library. It's go support your library because the library is going to help me achieve my dreams. And that's enough different flavor that a second thing that this does is it builds advocates. No longer does the librarian have to be the only one advocating. You have built a whole cadre of people who want this support, who will go to decision makers and go to influencers in the community and say, we have to have this. This is important to me. Another piece that you've done is you've built some sustained relationships. We know that relationships are foundational to advocacy. And hopefully you've built relationships with groups and individuals that you didn't have relationships with before. So reaching out into the community, going into areas where maybe there weren't library users, those are the kinds of relationships that will build new library users and certainly build new library supporters. People who are willing to stand up and say, yes, this is important to my community. I think it's important for us to realize, the Pew study said this as well, that we're not just talking to library users, but library supporters. And sometimes people can be very strong supporters when they don't actually frequent the doors of the library very often. Another piece that you will have done is you will have gathered evidence. Now, we know that we can't go to decision makers and say, you need to support the library because you need to support the library. And we also can't anymore go to decision makers and say, well, we circulated 5 times more books and therefore you need to support the library, because there's so much more value to a library than simple circulation statistics. The stories and the data and the anecdotes and the dreams and aspirations, all of that you have gathered from the interviews are the evidence that then you can use to be convincing as you go to decision makers to advocate. And sharing that evidence, sharing the stories in a public way so that your public who are advocating also have access to that evidence. Of course, anonymized, but it's nice to have those stories and anecdotes and real evidence that people can share. You will have empowered your community members and your decision makers to understand that this is not just a library issue, this is a community issue. And as they build the library, they are building the community. And certainly that's where we want the focus to be. We talk a lot about the lack of public forums, of democracy, of places where people can engage civically. And certainly decision makers would be very pleased to know that you have involved the community, that you have tapped into community priorities, and that you're going to help legislators and decision makers achieve what their community members want. So you become an advocate for the decision maker. I guess to sum it up, I would just say that the real power of this approach is that you're building an advocacy plan that is fundamentally tied to the aspirations and the dreams of your community, and that is framed around a very positive view of your community, of pulling your community together in a way that we don't have in all of our communities. Libraries can transform themselves to reach this new role of community engagement, of invigorating democracy, and of enabling all of our community members to reach their dreams.
Thank you, Barbara Stripling, for sharing this insight and this research and your own experience in advocacy and in teaching advocacy. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.